gun violence tax is a way to address a broad public safety concern.
The actual residents of the city of Seattle will not see fewer murders, will not see fewer guns.
Coming up on City Inside Out, gun rights activists are up in arms over a new Seattle tax on firearms and ammunition. Gun safety advocates say the money will help pay for gun violence research and prevention. But does this new tax preempt the state's gun laws? And should gun owners be fined if they do not report stolen or lost firearms?
Where does it stop?
Our panel weighs in.
We must do something.
Is the city taking aim at your Second Amendment rights? Seattle's new gun tax, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Seattle has just enacted a new tax on firearms and ammunition intended to reduce gun violence. The city says the tax would raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for prevention programs and research. But opponents say the tax will only push gun shop owners out of town, and they filed a lawsuit claiming the city is preempting state gun laws. So the stage has been set for a showdown between city leaders aiming to improve public safety and gun shop owners who say they're being unfairly targeted. Can you put a price tag on the impact of gun violence? Seattle was the first city in the country to research that question 3 years ago. Harborview Medical Center found there were $17 million in direct medical costs from gunshot wounds in Seattle in 2014. $12 million, or 70% of that, was covered by taxpayers. And people hospitalized for firearm injuries were 30 times more likely to be rehospitalized for another firearm injury.
That led us to conclude that gun violence is a serious issue.
That also led City Council member Tim Burgess to work on passing a law, taxing guns and ammunition sales as of January 1st in Seattle.
I think we're actually trying to apply some common sense, pragmatic solutions here to address a real public health concern, and that is the large number of people who are injured by firearms every year.
The tax, $25 per firearm, 2 cents for bullets of .22 caliber or smaller, and 5 cents a bullet for all other ammunition, is projected to bring in $300,000 to $500,000 a year for prevention and research programs. But that projection is way off target, says Seattle gun shop owner Sergey Solyanik.
No one will buy anything here when they can drive a few miles to the east or to the west or to the south and buy the same things at better prices.
Solyanik, along with the NRA and other gun rights groups, is suing the city for preempting Washington gun law. That law says Seattle and other cities may not pass gun regulations that are more restrictive than the state's. A King County judge ruled in favor of the city in December of last year. But Solyanik is appealing that decision. He calls the city's gun tax a political shakedown.
For them it was just wink, wink, nod, nod. We can't regulate the industry because the state preemption law, but we'll simply tax it out of existence.
Solyanik is no longer selling guns or ammo at his store on Aurora Avenue North. He's planning to move his business to Linwood in the next few months. He questions how higher taxes on his store and the handful of others that sell firearms in city limits will truly have an impact on gun violence. Cook County, Illinois, passed a gun tax similar to Seattle's in 2013, and homicides have risen around the Chicago area in the 2 years since.
The people who are criminals have really nothing to do in the stores. They never get guns from the store. It's pointless for them to even show up here because they will fail the background check. They cannot buy a gun here. The actual residents of the city of Seattle will not see fewer murders, will not see fewer guns because, again, it's not really that difficult for people to drive for 3 miles more and buy them outside the city.
This is not an attempt to control criminal behavior. This is a public health response to a crisis.
Burgess says the city is hoping to make an impact on a broad spectrum of gun violence issues. The legislation now in effect also requires mandatory reporting of lost or stolen guns. Burgess says the city is trying to protect the public in a number of ways.
It's not just the criminal use of firearms. Most of the harm caused by firearms are unintended shootings and suicide attempts. We as a community should do something to reduce those, and that's our purpose.
Burgess says a Harborview alcohol intervention program 20 years ago reduced hospital admissions for alcohol-related injuries by 50%. He says new gun regulations could have the same effect.
We didn't do this because we wanted to challenge the Second Amendment or because we want to push all the gun stores out of Seattle. That's not our motivation at all. Our motivation is to increase public safety and address a real public health crisis in our city. And that's the harm that firearms cause.
So Yannick and other gun rights supporters aren't buying that. They say the city is unfairly blaming them for Seattle's gun violence issues, rather than finding any real answers.
They don't want to do this work. They just want to find a scapegoat and basically pretend that they did something by essentially running the scapegoat out of town.
We have a panel here to offer a number of different perspectives on Seattle's gun tax, including Margie Heldring. She is the founder of Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. Margie, very good to have you here.
Thank you.
We also have with us Phil Watson of the Second Amendment Foundation. Phil, thank you very much for being here too. Also, Dr. Ali Rohani. He's a professor at the UW School of Public Health, a doctor at Harborview Medical Center who has done research for the city of Seattle on the gun violence issue. Doctor, thank you for being here. And finally, we have via phone Dr. Tim Wheeler, Director of Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And Margie, I want to start with you. Tell me why you're involved in this issue. You support this guns and ammo tax in Seattle. Why?
I do support this, and so does my organization, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. We became involved after the tragedy at the Sandy Hook Elementary School when 4 of us grandmothers were having lunch and realized that we were all grandmothers of 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, and it could have been any one of us who had experienced that tragedy of that day. And we decided we must do something, and we have been doing something ever since, working hard on this issue. We are very proud of the city of Seattle for the leadership it is showing in taking these steps.
Okay, very well. Thank you. We'll get some more background on that as we go along here.
Sure.
Phil, I'm going to bring you in here. You're one of the plaintiffs in the case against Seattle's guns and ammo tax here. What are your concerns about this legislation? Why do you oppose it?
Well, I oppose it for several different reasons. Taxing an enumerated constitutional right is against many Supreme Court decisions, as well as the state preemption statute, which preempts all firearms laws and regulations. So those are the main 2 reasons we're against that.
Tell me, do you have any beef with the city's effort to require reporting of lost or stolen guns? I know that's another piece of this.
Well, that's sort of a separate issue. They passed a separate law at the same time. I guess that's another debate on that law for a different day. But right now, I'd like to focus on the gun tax.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Rohani, I know you want to make clear that you're working as a scientist and not an advocate in this matter. Your work on gun violence is not paid for through the gun tax. I want to make that clear, too. The city decided to start funding your research 3 years ago. Tell us about that research. What have you found?
Sure. So it was after Sandy Hook that we were approached by Councilmember Tim Burgess and his colleagues to really think about ways that we could potentially reduce gun violence in our community. We do know that it's a public health problem, but the question is how to actually approach that. There are differences of opinions about that. And one of the studies that we did was an observational study in which we looked at people who had been shot and had been hospitalized anywhere in our state. And we followed them for 5 years. We looked at their records to see what happened to them after they were released from the hospital. And some of the statistics or numbers that you just heard came from that study. We found really staggering numbers. We found that they were about 20 to 30 times more likely to get shot again and come back and get hospitalized. We found that they were 4 times more likely to die because of firearm-related injury, and we found that they were about 3 times more likely to commit a crime. So the natural next step was to do something about it. This is a problem. We need to do something about it. And that was basically the impetus for the next study, which is the intervention study that I'm happy to talk to you after.
We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Thank you very much for that background, though. Dr. Wheeler, I want to bring you in here because your group, Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership, does not support this tax and also doesn't buy the idea of framing gun violence as a public health concern. Why is that?
That's correct, Brian. Our viewers today will not see most of the other side of this debate because it has been excluded. They can go to DRGO's website, drgo.us, to find out the mountain of criminology research that has been done on the issue of firearm violence. But all of this is overshadowed by two other serious problems, civil rights problems, actually. The City Council has knowingly imposed new taxes that are intended to cripple the exercise of, as Bill Watson said, the exercise of one of our enumerated civil rights, the right to own firearms. In the last century, many states imposed poll taxes with the intent of keeping African Americans from voting, and this is no different. The second civil rights issue is that the City Council's new guns and ammo tax law has a disparate impact on the poor and on minorities who live in the city's high crime areas. These people, because of their circumstances, have a greater need for self-defense than most people because they live in those neighborhoods where Dr. Rouhani's repeat violent offenders that he described in his study live and commit their violent crimes. So the Seattle City Council is apparently indifferent or is unaware of the disparate impact of their onerous new taxes on people of color and the poor.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Margie, you had a point you wanted to make there.
I actually have 2 points I'd like to make, Brian. Thank you. One is I think it's important to remember and to remind everybody that the Superior Court has upheld this new tax, and I'm sure you were about to get to that, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that the issue has already been closely looked at, and
yet still under appeal as it stands right now.
It's still under appeal, but we expect that it will stay the course.
Okay.
The second is to really support what Dr. Rouhani said and what his point about how valuable data is and how valuable research is, and we can't find solutions to this problem of gun violence until we know the data, until we know and have the evidence for what are some of the risk factors, what are some of the strategies that might work. And when the federal government dropped the ball on funding research, the City of Seattle has stepped up.
I want to challenge you, though, when it comes to data here, because I think there's a financial point to this that was brought up certainly in the setup piece. You heard that gun shop owner talking about it, raising up to $500,000 annually for this tax, for prevention programs, for research. He says it simply won't happen because people will buy guns and ammo elsewhere. He says the goal of this is just to push him out of town. How do you respond to that piece of it?
Well, the revenue generated by this new tax is just going to be for the general welfare. Yes, some for research, no doubt about it, into gun violence. But this is new revenue for the city. And
but is that revenue going to exist if you raise those prices up to that point?
Well, time will tell us. I believe it will.
Okay.
I believe it will, because there's usually, after a new, something is new, there's a period of kind of wobbliness.
Sure.
And then people adjust and come back to their standard ways of doing things.
Okay.
So I don't think we'll lose, the gun stores will lose as many customers as they fear they will.
Phil, let me bring in, and I'm going to kind of do the flip side of this argument here, because the city points out that with other added costs for businesses in Seattle, like paid sick leave or minimum wage, for example, we heard a lot of the same complaints. This is bad for business. You're going to shut stores down. But for the most part, businesses have not left town. They're dealing with those added costs. New taxes happen all the time, including so-called sin taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, or whatever else. Why is this tax any different?
Well, there's several different reasons why it's different. I have to come back to, one, it's a constitutional right. If you have taxes on newspapers or print or ink, or your ability to go on the internet, for example, where does it stop? So this is sort of a Trojan horse, if you will. If we let taxes like this keep going, it just goes out of control. So if a $25 tax is okay, why not a $100 tax or a $500 tax? It's too much, and the Supreme Court has ruled that several times when they talk about when people want to tax newspapers, for example. It's your right as a journalist under the Constitution. So when we talk about taxing a constitutional right, it just doesn't pass muster.
Okay. All right. We'll see what the different courts say about that. Thank you for that viewpoint. Dr. Rouhani, I want to bring you into this and talk about what some critics might say about your work. If you're going to consider guns as a public health issue, why not see how many times guns have saved a life in self-defense? Is that part of the equation at all in your work?
Oh, it absolutely is. I think it's really, really important to stay as unbiased as possible in this type of work.
Difficult to do.
Emotions run high for sure, and I think you can really save lives when you have an unbiased view of this. When you can actually look at the evidence, totality of evidence, for or against, and then we can come up with a conclusion and we can inform policy.
Okay.
Part of the problem, part of the challenge, Brian, is that we do need to do more research because we haven't done enough of it.
Okay. Okay.
So it is sad and unfortunate that many of the questions that you could raise, actually I may not know the answer to them because we haven't done enough research to actually be able to answer your question.
I see. So that research on the potential positive impacts of gun ownership it just hasn't been done?
Absolutely. The research, we need to do research on the whole spectrum on this to come up with solutions and to come up with conclusions that actually could inform proper policies.
Okay.
One of the things I always say is that when we want to come up with an intervention, well, we should study it first to see whether it works or not. If it doesn't work, we should probably not put our money and investment into it instead of trying to defend it.
Okay.
So in answer to your question, I would say that we definitely need to support research and to do more research to understand what the next step really should be.
Okay.
To provide evidence for our next step.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Dr. Wheeler, I would like to bring you in here because I know you have some concerns about doctors overstepping their bounds and asking people if they have guns in their homes. But what if you determine that a patient might be in danger to himself or herself or maybe others? Doesn't it make sense to ask a patient about guns in the home in a situation like that?
Well, certainly if a doctor perceives that a patient is at risk for harming himself or herself or somebody else with a firearm because of some mental imbalance, mental disease, of course, that's the physician's obligation, and he or she should get involved. That is not at all what is being advocated by organized medicine, such as the AMA, the American Academy of Pediatrics. What they are doing is urging doctors to question their patients about guns in their homes and even to remove guns from their homes. In other words, and we keep getting back to this civil rights issue, in other words, they are telling doctors to urge their patients to give up one of their enumerated civil rights. And not just think about that for a minute, the implications of that.
Okay. You're just saying that you feel that doctors are betraying the trust they have with a patient, or what's the point you're trying to make there?
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, Brian, doctors who do that, who ask their patients politically motivated questions about guns in their homes, are overstepping a boundary. They are committing what's called an ethical boundary violation. And that's why Florida passed the law to make that illegal.
Okay, all right.
It's an ethical boundary violation, and doctors who commit that should be disciplined.
Fair enough. Margie, you had a point you wanted to make.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just disagree respectfully with Dr. Wheeler to say that what he's describing could also be called prevention. It's looking ahead and preventing a problem, a tragedy from happening. And that is certainly a place where public health and medicine converge, is to do that. And physicians, pediatricians, family doctors ask a lot about tobacco, ask about seatbelt use, ask about nutrition. They ask about many different things that can promote or interfere with the health of children and families.
Right.
What I would like to see is for these major medical organizations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AMA, to partner with the real experts on firearm safety education. You know, the NRA and its state affiliates and countless gun clubs around the country have been doing this for years. They've spent tens of millions of dollars and countless volunteer hours teaching gun safety in every community across America. But consistently, the AAP, the AMA, the American College of Physicians have refused to work with these organizations. And that's because their main motive is not gun safety, it's gun prohibition.
Fair enough. A very politically charged debate. Thank you for that, Dr. Wheeler. Margie, I want to go back to you. We saw it in the setup piece. I want to talk to you about this. A gun tax similar to what was passed in Seattle was passed in Cook County, Illinois, and homicides have gone up in that area in the 2 years since. Critics would say, there's your evidence. This doesn't work. How do you look at that example?
That's a good question, Brian, and a couple responses to that. One is the reason for the increase in homicide is multifactorial, many reasons.
Yeah.
We cannot point to one thing.
Okay.
It is not about the economy only, or about family structure only, or about access to guns only. It's a very complex set of things that increases or decreases homicide.
Okay.
So to link those two, I think, is in error.
Okay.
And second of all, Chicago is a city of one. It's an N of one, as we call in our scientific research. One city, one case, one study. And it's too soon to generalize across the board to what might be.
We'll see what happens in Seattle. Phil, I'm going to bring you in here again for the flip side of this argument, because you heard Tim Burgess say in our setup piece, the majority of gun injuries in Seattle come from these accidental, unattended shootings, as they're sometimes called, or suicides, not criminal activity. So the city says Harborview has proved it. It can reduce these alcohol-related incidents with intervention. Why not try this type of approach to reduce firearm-related incidents?
Because that's not what the evidence points to Mr. Burgess doing. Through my public records requests, we found several emails between Mr. Burgess and other council members and anti-gun rights groups that basically point to their end goal being to get around the state preemption statute, not to prevent any of these things. So that's really their goal. Their goal is to set a precedent for a loophole in the state law. So that's really their end goal, and the public record shows that.
Okay, fair enough. Dr. Rouhani, I know the city has given you a new grant to continue to study gun violence. You mentioned this earlier. Talk to me about this. What do you hope to accomplish with this?
Sure, thanks, Brian. And again, thank you for mentioning that actually we are not using the gun tax money for this study.
Right.
We plan to do a study it's called Helping Individuals with Firearm Injuries. And what we plan to do is to provide people who have been shot with a series of services to support them, to help them transition back into the community after they are discharged. As I mentioned to you, the previous study really showed some dramatic numbers in terms of the risk of injury and crime and death after these people leave the hospital. So as I mentioned, we needed to think about doing something about it. And our new intervention consists of several different components. I can mention a couple of them to you briefly.
Yeah.
One is what's called the motivational interviewing, which is basically approaching these individuals at the hospital, talking to them, asking about their problems, asking about their needs. And then they're trying to link them to what's called the extended community outreach program, to help them, to support them, to overcome the challenges that they faced in their life. So if they need a job, or if they need education, if they need substance abuse help, if they need mental illness help, things like that. And we follow them for a year, and we measure certain outcomes to see whether this intervention works or not. As I mentioned to you, if it works, maybe it will have the potential to actually translate into a policy such as the alcohol policy that you mentioned. If it doesn't work, maybe we should put our money in something that actually works.
Fair enough.
So that's the research that we're doing.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wheeler, I want to bring it back in here to touch on a point that you had made earlier. I know supporters of the gun tax have said that any effort to study the effects of gun violence have been suppressed by the NRA and other Second Amendment supporters. I'm trying to figure out what type of research would work. What type of research could both sides potentially agree to here in terms of ending this issue of gun violence? Because I think everybody wants to end that piece of it. Help me out with that thought if you can.
Well, there's no doubt, Brian, that gun owners, the NRA, all of us want to reduce gun injuries. I would like to take this opportunity, now that you asked that, to debunk one of the major myths that has gone on about the NRA and gun research. The prevailing narrative out there that has been promoted endlessly in the media is that the NRA stopped gun research at the CDC back in the 1990s. That is absolutely, entirely false. And I know because I was one of 4 medical doctors who testified to the House Appropriations Committee about the misdeeds at the top levels of leadership at the CDC back then in the 1990s. and how they were using taxpayer money to do things like pay for an anti-gun newsletter for a gun control outfit out here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay.
And about how CDC leadership had told of their plans to use the CDC and its massive resources to prejudice Americans against gun ownership, to make, as Mark Rosenberg, the director of the National Center for Injury and Prevention and Control at the CDC, as he once said, to make firearms perceived as dirty, deadly, and banned, B-A-N-N-E-D.
Okay.
So Congress was just amazed at this.
Yeah.
So what they did was to tell the CDC that they couldn't do that anymore, that they could not use tax money to promote gun control activities. And they said nothing at all about research. They said, this is from the congressional records, the appropriations bill contained, quote, a limitation to prohibit the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the Centers for Disease Control from engaging in any activities to advocate or promote gun control.
Okay.
Period.
I got it.
Not, in fact, they said in the appropriations bill that it was okay to go ahead and gather statistics about firearm deaths.
Dr. Wheeler, I'm going to stop you right there because I need to start wrapping up the show. Thank you for making that point. I know this is a debate that's very much still open, and I know that there's a court case going on right now regarding this gun tax, but I do need to wrap up the show. Dr. Rouhani, I can give you about 20, 30 seconds here. What are your expectations about trends in gun violence in our city? Could they be affected with this new gun tax? What do you think?
They may. It's very difficult to speculate at this time. But I'm optimistic. I remain optimistic that with raising awareness and with engaging different communities and different parties here and working collaboratively with each other, I remain optimistic that we can reduce the rate of firearm injuries in our city even more.
Dr. Wheeler, I'll go to you. How do you think this tax will impact gun violence in Seattle? I'll give you 20 seconds.
It won't make a difference at all, but what it will do, Brian, is to impair the right of regular, good, law-abiding citizens in Seattle to be able to buy firearms for legitimate purposes.
Fair enough. Margie, your final thoughts.
My final thoughts. I think it will make a difference. I share the optimism. I think it's clearly the will of the people.
Okay.
I think the community of Seattle, the state of Washington, are saying repeatedly, we want steps taken to reduce and to prevent gun violence. And I'm excited to see this happening.
Phil, I'm going to give you the last word, 20 seconds.
It won't make any difference. Tim Burgess and the City Council and the anti-gun groups will continue their anti-gun crusade.
All right, fair enough. Thank you all for your input here, and we will be right back.
I'm in favor of gun control. I think it'll keep guns out of poor people's hands, maybe, because they wouldn't be able to afford the tax.
I think that tax would probably be, in my opinion, a bad idea.
Well, I think people aren't going to want to spend extra money on taxes. They're going to start buying their guns illegally.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter and give us your feedback.
Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Do you support Seattle's new gun tax? Yes, no, or are you unsure? We want to hear what you think. Cast your vote and send us your comments at our website, seattlechanel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next week, helping the homeless. The City of Seattle is trying several creative solutions to address this growing crisis. Are they working? We take an in-depth look next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.